There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, but I think you've probably heard of them before. The first is the sympathetic division, and the other is the parasympathetic division. Your sympathetic nervous system coordinates the body's fight or flight response, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later in the course. Your parasympathetic division coordinates the rest and digest response, and I'll also talk about that a little bit later as well. On this slide, we're taking a look at some of the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. So if you take a look at the diagram that's on the right-hand side, you can see anatomical representations from both the parasympathetic nervous system, that's on the left-hand side, and the sympathetic nervous system, that's on the right-hand side. In between each of those images, you have a bunch of organs that are representing the target tissues. Again, anything other than skeletal muscle. So that would include the tear ducts in your eyes, the cardiac muscle in your heart, the smooth muscle in your lungs, the glands in your digestive system. And again, even though you have two divisions, if you look at any given organ, you can see that it's actually hooked up to both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. In other words, if I were to trace the path back from the heart in red, I could see that the heart was connected to the parasympathetic nervous system. And if I was to trace from the heart the path in blue, I could see that the heart was connected to the sympathetic division. So this is the same story for almost all of the tissues inside the body. There's a couple exceptions. Again, skeletal muscle, because it's not part of the autonomic nervous system, but there's a few other exceptions too. But for the most part, every single organ is innervated by both divisions, and that concept is known as dual innervation. Every organ receives input from both divisions. Now, the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, we can think about anatomically and physiologically. I'm going to talk about the anatomical differences first, and those differences are going to be either preganglionic differences, so associated with the preganglionic neuron, or postganglionic differences, so thinking more about the postganglionic side of things. So I'm going to talk about the sympathetic division first. And all the sympathetic preganglionic neurons originate entirely within the central nervous system. In fact, they originate entirely within the spinal cord. Preganglionic sympathetic neurons can originate between your thoracic and your lumbar spinal cord section. So basically from your neck all the way down to somewhere close to your tailbone, you could expect to find preganglionic sympathetic neurons coming out of your spinal cord. In terms of the postganglionic features, here in the sympathetic division, there are three postganglionic structures that I want you to be familiar with. You really only have to be familiar with them in name, because you're not going to have to match up any structure with the target tissues that it controls or anything like that. But I do want you to know the components of the sympathetic nervous system. So in terms of the ganglia, the components are the sympathetic chain ganglia, the collateral ganglia, and the adrenal glands. In each of those is referring to a place where the preganglionic sympathetic neuron is going to synapse with a postganglionic cell. So we'll think about the sympathetic chain ganglia first, because actually most of the body's sympathetic functions are passing through the sympathetic chain. It's the largest set of ganglia within the autonomic nervous system. And if you take a look at the diagram on the left here, you can really see those preganglionic neurons that are originating within the ventral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. And you can also see how they come out through the ventral root of the spinal cord. But immediately after coming out, immediately adjacent to the spinal cord on the side there, those preganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to synapse with a postganglionic neuron. And again, that synapse is the ganglia. And because this is taking place at many different levels in the spinal cord, this eventually forms a chain of ganglia all the way down the spinal cord from the thoracic through lumbar segments. That's where it gets its name from. Now, one thing that isn't super clear from this diagram, but we know from talking about earlier units, is that pretty much everything in the nervous system is symmetrical. So the sympathetic chain ganglia is actually present on both sides of the spinal cord. But in this diagram, it's only represented on the right-hand side. It should be present on the left-hand side too, but they probably just left it off for simplicity. Now, a smaller collection of sympathetic ganglia is known as the collateral ganglia. And the major difference is that in this case, we have preganglionic neurons that originate on both sides of the spinal cord, so come out through both ventral roots. But instead of synapsing on either side to form the chain, they actually keep going around to the ventral surface, and that's where they're going to synapse with their postganglionic neurons. So the ganglia is actually located on the ventral surface of the spinal cord. And from there, the postganglionic neurons will go out to the target tissues. Now, the collateral ganglia are mostly involved in regulating the functions of the digestive system and of the reproductive system. And you don't have to know the names of the collateral ganglia, but I did list them down at the bottom of the slide, mostly because I thought it might be helpful to remind you of their overall function. They control GI structures and reproductive structures. You can remember this because if you've ever heard of celiac disease, you know that it's an issue affecting the digestive system primarily. And one of the collateral ganglia is the celiac ganglia. The term mesentery refers to connective tissues in the gut, and that's why we have a superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia. So all of these are collateral ganglia. But again, there's just a handful of them. Most sympathetic output comes through the sympathetic chain instead. So here's another view of the organization of the sympathetic division. We can see that all of the origins for the preganglionic neurons are within the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord really nicely in this diagram. And we can also see, if we look at the sympathetic chain, that there's a lot of preganglionic neurons coming in, there's a lot of postganglionic neurons coming out. The thing that this diagram is probably the worst at is representing the collateral ganglia, but that's because this is a two-dimensional diagram, and it's hard to represent the actual location of the collateral ganglia because they're located on the ventral surface, so they would be out in front. They'd have to be superimposed on top of the spinal cord. It'd probably be messy to draw. The third possibility for the sympathetic division is a kind of a special case. If you take a close look at the diagram here, you can see that one of the sympathetic pathways originating from the central nervous system goes all the way to the top of the kidneys, which is where the adrenal glands are located. This is unique because most of the preganglionic neurons that are coming out in the sympathetic division are actually quite short because they only have to go to right next to the spinal cord where they're going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. But in this example, we have kind of a long preganglionic neuron that goes all the way to the top of the kidney, and it synapses with the cells that make up your adrenal gland. This is a special case because the postganglionic cells here aren't neurons. They're actually endocrine tissue. So instead of having a preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic cell that's actually an epithelial cell. So again, it's not nervous tissue. And that's what the picture here on the right side is trying to represent, the synapse between an axon terminal, the preganglionic neuron, and the epithelial cell. Now, the adrenal glands are actually made up of a couple of different types of tissue. So there's an outermost layer, which is colored in pink in this diagram, and that's known as the adrenal cortex. That's a true endocrine tissue, and that's not what we're talking about here. The part that we're interested in is actually the deeper portion, which is colored in blue in this diagram, and that's known as the adrenal medulla. That's the part that takes the place of what should be the postganglionic neurons. The cells located here are known as chromaffin cells. The adrenal medulla chromaffin cells are an example of a neuroendocrine tissue because they're endocrine cells that are regulated by the nervous system. But like any endocrine cell, when we stimulate them, they're going to release their secretions into the bloodstream. And this is one of the reasons why we're going to say later that the sympathetic division is organized for massive discharge. Usually synapses between neurons are really specific and very localized, so the effects are limited to a certain region of the body. But the sympathetic division, because one of its components is the adrenal gland, actually has the ability to get signals sent throughout the entire body using the bloodstream.